Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brownie and I'm one half the Indecisive Readers. As you may have seen from me, oh my god, trying to do my thumbnail, I read quite a lot of books in October, so I think this is going to be a long video, which probably doesn't help that I faffed for 4 minutes at the start trying to get a thumbnail. So in October I read 17 books. A few of them were short books. A lot of them were ebooks. I read 11 ebooks, 2 audiobooks and 4 physical books. A couple I had to carry over into the into the start of November just because I only had like 70 pages left, but for some reason I just didn't read them. But yeah, I read an awful lot in October, ironically because I had a job. My average rating was 3.2 stars. I read a lot of books that I liked but didn't love, if that makes sense. And yeah, I'm just gonna start because otherwise we'll be here forever. One of the things I want to note before I go in is that I read a lot of books with asexual characters because at some point in the month there was Asexual Awareness Week, and because I identify as demisexual, which is on the ace spectrum, I wanted to read some books in that kind of spectrum if I could find them. I didn't want to specifically buy any, but it turns out I had a lot on my TBR that did have ace characters, which is really cool. The first book I read in October was Radium Girls by Raybearer. This is a YA kind of horror, but like kind of a body horror. I picked it up because it is slightly horror and it's about as far horror as I want to go, and it's Halloween, so I felt I should kind of read a lot of spooky / horror reads. You'll find a lot of those in this kind of wrap up. This is about a school where there's a contamination. Somehow I managed to read about 2 kind of quarantines, which is great. And it kind of manifests differently in each girl there. Most of the pupils are still there, but almost all of the teachers died. And yeah, they're basically in this tiny little island. There's basically no food. They keep getting ill, and then one of the girls disappears and it's the main character's best friend, and obviously she wants to go and rescue her. I didn't really know a lot about this going into it, but I found it a very quick and easy read. I read it probably within 2 days, maybe less. It was very easy to read. It's quite drawing you in. There's not a word, that's not a word. It drew you in. The atmosphere was quite claustrophobic because you are set in one place and you don't really know anything. But then when you do learn stuff, the main character doesn't. And so you're just kind of cheering them on, waiting for them to find everything out. I thought the time frame was really interesting because it all happened within a space of a couple of days. And again, that added to the atmosphere, made it really kind of tense. And I just thought the disease was interesting because it manifested differently in each girl, and I thought that was good because usually you'll just have all the same symptoms, but because all these different things happened, you didn't know which was going to be real and you didn't know what was related to the disease and you didn't really know why it was happening. And yeah, I thought it was very interesting and rated it 3 stars. The next book I picked up in October was kind of less a spooky read and more I picked it up because it was an art, and that is The Wolf and the Water by Josie Jaffrey. I got sent this by the author for review, so kind of doesn't affect my rating but is worth noting. This is a retelling of Atlantis, kind of, based around a girl called Carla whose father dies at the beginning of the plot, but because of patriarchal society, her mother has to remarry straight away. The new husband, new father is horrible, but even worse is the brother, who is too kind, and she doesn't want him to be kind because she wants to hate him. And whilst this is going on, she's trying to investigate the murder of her father, or at least what she thinks is the murder of her father. And also there is a secret behind the wall, which is like plot. I like this one. I rated it 3 stars. I thought the history and the kind of mystery was really interesting. The mystery kept me reading and I didn't know how it was gonna happen, how it was gonna work out. I will admit I found the kind of ending a little bit underwhelming, but it did keep me interested for the whole thing. I didn't quite know how it's gonna end up. I liked how the history and the kind of mythology and the lore was kind of integrated into the story. I thought it was quite clever because it was just, there would be a chapter and at the start of each chapter there would be a bit of history, and I thought that was really well done. I didn't like the romance. The romance was going to be a big plot, but the romance is kind of between step siblings, which is weird. And I mean, they haven't been brought up together, but we failed to address how weird it is. And if they just kind of live next to each other, that'd be fine. But the guy was constantly calling her sister, and also she clearly didn't want to be involved at the start. I mean, she did want to be involved, but like she kept saying no, and then he kept pursuing her, which was a bit weird. The main character, Carla, has a disability, a physical disability, and whilst everyone else kind of lets it define her because she's cursed, she doesn't let it define her. She's quite stubborn, and I shouldn't run up and down the stairs. And yeah, if you wanted to read more stories about Atlantis, because I haven't read any, would recommend. The next book I picked up was the audiobook for Lair of Dreams by Raybearer. This is the second book in the Diviner series, which follows a group of people in New York City in the 1920s who all have kind of magical diviner abilities. The kind of main character, Evie O'Neill, has ability to read memories and history from kind of objects, so she might touch a comb or a purse and she knows some of the history. And there are other characters in it. There are a lot of other characters. This is the second one, so I can't really tell you what it's about, but each has a kind of supernatural mystery that the main characters kind of all end up banding together to solve. The first book in this series, The Diviners, I really didn't love. I was going to say I really didn't like, but I did like it. I just didn't love it. I thought it was all right, but I got a bit confused. I felt like it didn't quite follow the story, and so maybe because of that happening last time, or just because the story was better, I enjoyed this one a lot more. I made more effort in listening and paying attention to it. I kind of saw where they were all linked. They all became one bigger story rather than lots of different stories, and so I enjoyed this one a lot more and have since picked up the first one because I previously listened to the first one and actually listened to the second one, and I'm currently listening to the third one from my library. I think they're better to be read, but I think the audiobooks are really good. It has like not a full cast, but the narrator does different voices, and I quite like books that do that. Once again, I picked up this one because it's kind of as horror as I like to go, and it freaked me out less than the first one. The last one was kind of more horror, this one was more spooky, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the mystery. I didn't really know where it was going to go. I like all the different diviner abilities, occult abilities, and I like that they weren't all the same, so it made it different and mysterious. I like a lot of the characters, but not all of them. I particularly like Evie and Sam and Henry. I wasn't a big fan, and still continue not to be a big fan, of Mabel and Jericho, and I'm not a huge fan of the implied love triangle between Evie, Sam and Jericho. I know which one I prefer. I very much liked the romance in this one. Oh, and I liked Ling as well. She was a new character in this. There is a gay character in this, and there is an implied asexual lesbian character in this, but I believe that it's explored more in the third one, so I'm hoping to find out more about that now. But that is one of my asexual characters I read about, and it was a bit weird because this was the other book with the disease and quarantine, and what made it even weirder was it was the Chinese sleeping sickness, and they had to wash their hands and they had to stay in quarantine, and it was all the Chinese and the immigrants, and I'm like, I don't want to read this. But I did really like how, like I said, a lot of the plot points were kind of twisted together. They made a bigger story, and now it's leading more towards sequels rather than just individual stories. And I rated this one 4 stars. The next book I picked up was The Familiars by Stacey Hall. I got this book actually gifted from Charlotte for my birthday, and I'm very grateful for that. And look at that shiny cover. It's a noose. I don't know if I'd noticed that before, but it's one of those covers that grows on you the more you look at it, and also it's really pretty and just autumnal. But that's not my review, that is just a note. This book is about a girl called Fleetwood Shuttleworth, and she's 17 years old and has had a couple of failed pregnancies before, but has a feeling that this will be her final chance to be pregnant, and so she comes across this woman in the woods and immediately trusts her and thinks she's going to be the best midwife ever. But she gets accused of witchcraft, the woman in the woods, not Fleetwood. And Fleetwood spends a lot of the book kind of fighting for this woman's right to be a person. I didn't realise before I read this, until I read the acknowledgements at the end, that this is actually based a lot on historical events. There were actual witchcraft trials that these were based on, and this book ends up kind of exploring those and exploring why things may have happened. I don't know, I think Fleetwood may have been real as well, I can't remember. But I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the exploration of womanhood and motherhood, because she's 17, she's still a baby herself and she's already lost some, but she lives in a world where a woman's only purpose is to have children, and it doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. It doesn't matter that your husband is off sleeping with other people, as long as you can have children. That's all that matters. And I felt really sorry for her because she had no one else around her who would kind of sympathise with her. I also found the exploration of witches to be really interesting, because we kind of have an image of witches now as these kind of cool things, but the witches in this are just women who have some agency, and apparently that makes them witches. And yeah, so I found that very interesting too. I rated this one 3 stars. The next one I read was Monstrous Heart by Claire McKenna. This was a NetGalley arc that I really didn't enjoy. I rated it 2 stars, and it's about a woman who has this ability to control a lighthouse for reasons, and she goes to control the lighthouse and has been a disappointment to her family, goes there, and her neighbour is rumoured to have killed his wife, but obviously she fancies the pants off him. That's kind of all the summary promised, which was confusing to me, because I'm pretty sure the first time I heard about it, it just sounded like a fantasy, and then it sounded like a historical romance, and then I read it and it was more like steampunk, but I forgot the word steampunk until I read it. But it could have been really interesting. I think the kind of steampunk element, had it been explored, could have been really interesting, but as it was just there, and we were kind of expected to understand it but not really offered any exploration. Like, these gifts could have been really interesting, but they just kind of existed and that was it. I also found it incredibly dull. Like, fiction books I can generally read and it's fine, but like this one, I genuinely felt like I was falling asleep at times. I was like, I don't know what I've read, I don't know what I'm reading, and for probably genuinely the first 40-50%, I wasn't interested. And there was like a bit in the middle, about 30% long, which I was like, oh, it's picked up, this really interesting stuff's happening. And then again, the last 20%, I'm like, I'm so bored. So if it wasn't a NetGalley arc, I probably would have DNF'd it. And I don't DNF many books, but I just wasn't interested in what was happening in this one. And then the romance was just weird, because there are a lot of trigger warnings in all of these books, and I will link them all down below. But in this, the love interest is implied to be a rapist. Actually, I don't think it's even implied, I think it's just told, like accused. And the main character kind of has fantasies about it happening to her, which is just wrong. And then supposedly I think it does actually happen, and she's like, oh, that's cool, that's really romantic, and I'm like, no. But the love interest himself is actually really interesting despite that happening, because I don't think it actually does happen. It's not a spoiler, I don't think I'm selling it, I don't think any of you are going to read it, but he doesn't actually rape a lot of these people, or any of these people. And I think you kind of expect him to be this butch kind of surly man who is evil, and I think there's a lot more to him than that. I think he's a much more nuanced character, and I think that is much more interesting than just a man who does all the bad stuff. And honestly, that's about the only good thing I can pull out of this. The next book I read was Every Heart a Doorway by Sean Ann Maguire. I rated this one 5 stars. That's 10 stars. I am undoubtedly a little bit biased, because there is again an asexual, aromantic character, and I loved them and it made me really happy to read. I sent all the kind of screenshots where she was talking about her sexuality to Sam, and Sam was like, it must be really nice for you, and I'm like, it is really nice for me. I like seeing that character and I like seeing myself, because like so often I think these things but I don't always put them into words, and then actually seeing them in words I was like, yes. This is about a kind of magical boarding school where these children go after they've gone to another world. They've stepped through a door and they've gone to this other world, and then they somehow find their way back, and you can never really find your way home to these magical worlds, and these people are in grieving and they want to go back but they can't, because once that door's shut, it's always shut, and it's sad. And I really liked it. There was a mystery element to it that I wasn't expecting, but it kept me guessing. I kind of, did I guess who it was? Maybe, but only after there were clues, and I liked it and it kept me guessing, and I liked all the different worlds. I liked that they weren't all kind of magical and shiny. Some of them were, but some of them weren't always, and they weren't always perfect. And I thought it was very interesting, and I liked that they kind of matched each of the characters. I liked the kind of band of misfits friends that were in this. I liked that they were just kind of all banded together, didn't judge each other. There was a trans masculine character, and he was unwelcome at home because he felt like he should be male, and he was male in his world, and no one at home believed him, and that was sad. But everyone else here kind of accepted him, and if they didn't accept him, everyone else would shout at them, and it made me very happy. It was very welcoming, very nice, and I just can't think of words. It was quite short, but I wish I could have stayed in it for longer, but I do have the next one, so I will undoubtedly read the next ones because the world makes me happy. Then, speaking of short books, I read this one the same day as the last one, and that is Come Close by Sappho. This is one of those, I have a book like it. This is one of those Penguin Classics, which is that small, and it just has a couple of excerpts from Sappho's poems. Like, Sappho was this amazing poet in her time. She was like the most celebrated, people used to love her, and yet we don't have any of her writing left, or if we do, it's like literally just fragments. I rated this one 3 stars, not because I didn't like the poetry, but I never connect to poetry, and so I tend to not read it just because I know I'm not going to rate it particularly well, just because I'm like, poems, it's fine. And that's kind of what I felt like with this. I didn't necessarily connect to the poetry, which is fine for me. My main problem with it was because it was so short, it didn't explore the poems, and not necessarily the poems, but what I wanted it to explore was the gaps in the poems, because like I said, we just don't have it there. And so I really wanted to see what more could have been there, what we think is missing, what we think there could be, and how we've learned what we have, if that makes sense. I just think it's a real shame that this is all we know of her, because we should know more about her, because everyone liked her at the time, but because she wasn't a man, we've chosen to destroy all of that. And when it is there, it's only translated by men. I think there's only been one woman who's translated that, and that's Anne Carson. And so I do want to get a copy of that to read it. But yeah, I just felt like I only read half of it, which I did. And I feel like I wanted it performed, because that's how it should be performed, how it should be kind of received. But it was fine. And I read it for the Tit Sticks and Feminist Bits book club, because the pick was Forgotten Women, and so who is more forgotten than Sappho? I mean, a lot more women are more forgotten than Sappho, because we know who Sappho is. But I read it anyway for that theme. The next book I read was Cryer's War by Nina Varela. This is a very shiny book. Once again, it was gifted to me by Tori, who is lovely, and I very much appreciated getting this. It was so kind of her, and it makes me very happy, and I do love the cover. This is about a world in which there are these new things that aren't quite human. They're like called automane, Autome. Come on. Called the Autome, and they are robot people, but like better than people. Max, please don't dribble on all my books. But they're better than people, and they're living in a world where they've taken over kind of the human realm. They are better than them, they are in control of them, and we follow two perspectives. We follow the kind of king of the Autome, his daughter, who's called Lady Crier, and we follow a human who is called Isla. I very much enjoyed this. I rated it 3 stars. I thought the concept of the world was really interesting. I liked the Autome. I liked kind of how they were similar to people but not quite people. I just wish we'd got to explore them a bit more. Because of how we experience them, whose eyes we see them through, we get quite a limited perspective. We have one who is obviously pro-Autome because she is one, and we also have one that is anti-Autome but also fancies them, but we'll come back to that. And so I feel like we didn't get to see that they were as bloodthirsty as we are told. We get to see them killing a couple of people, but most of the time they're just doing human things, and so we don't get to see like the distinction between human and Autome enough. At least that's what I found. But I did like how science is integrated into fantasy here, because it kind of implies that they're not as distinct as we are always told they are. I also liked how history was kind of integrated into this. We'd have a chapter, and then occasionally we'd get a kind of story or a snippet from some notes, and that would give you a bit more history and a bit more context of the book. I'm really looking forward to reading the sequel, because I think it'll be really interesting, and I think it will kind of close up a lot of loose ends from this one, because it is only a duology. And I'm hoping in the sequel we get to hear a bit more about Queen Jun, because she was really interesting as a human. And in terms of the romance, I knew there was going to be an LGBT plus romance in this, but I wasn't enamoured with it. I thought it was a bit kind of insta-lovey, which is not ideal for a romance that is meant to be enemies to lovers. It felt more like one was interest to lovers and the other was I don't really like you, but maybe I do like you. And then there was quite often in YA, it's not like I really like you, it's like, oh, I just must love you, and I'm like, but anyway, I did enjoy it. I rated it 3 stars, and I will be picking up the sequel. The next book I picked up was The Radium Girls by Kate Moore, which again I picked up for the theme Forgotten Women, because whilst this is a recent history kind of non-fiction, it is about a group of women whose story shouldn't have to be told. All these women, all these names are generally the women who were painting the dials in the radium factories. Now basically the radium factories came up after or during the First World War and carried on to kind of like the Second World War, because pilots needed dials painted and they needed to be painted in a way that we would be able to see them in the dark, and so obviously you choose glow-in-the-dark paint. Problem is that glow-in-the-dark paint was like poisonous and radioactive and basically killed all the women who were working with it, because they were actively told to get like a good point you have to like put it in your mouth, so like wet it so it's like really sharp. They were actively encouraged to do this, and they wanted to. Even if they weren't encouraged, they'd like paint it on their hair, they paint it on their face because it would make them look pretty when they went out. Some liked the taste, so would put it in their mouths. Most were told that it was good for them. There were a lot of kind of companies in America at the time who were actively making it into lube and toothpaste and other things in their house, and it's just horrible. I hate that this story has to be told. I'm so grateful that it has been told, but just the way it was, like the fact it had to happen in the first place is unreal. It's such a comprehensive story, and it covers so many women's stories, and it was really sad. Whilst I read a lot of horror and a lot of spooky books because Halloween, this is probably the most horrific book I read, and it wasn't even fake. This felt like it was. There's no way this could be real because it's so horrible, and it is. It's just, you just kept reading it and thinking it's going to get better, and it just doesn't. You know when you read a book and you're like, there are only so many things that can go wrong before something's going to happen. And that's what you keep waiting for in this. And it doesn't happen. I mean, it does happen in parts, but when something good happens, another bad thing happens. And it was very sad. And there were points in this where I genuinely thought I might cry. And it was a very good book and I'd really recommend it. There are a lot of trigger warnings and it's quite horrific and graphic in moments, but it was so good. And I did actually pick it up from the library, but obviously have now brought a book because I feel like this is the kind of book I may come back to and annotate and just recommend and share around because it's so interesting. Next, I read Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki. I rated this one 3 stars. It's a graphic novel about a girl called Freddie who is dating this girl called Laura Dean who keeps breaking up with her. This relationship she has with Laura Dean is ruining all her other relationships with her friends and her family and things. And I thought it was a very interesting book because it explores the effect a romantic relationship can have on everything else. And it made me really sad. I hated Laura Dean. I hated everything she did and how it negatively affected Freddie's life. And I just wanted to punch her a couple of times. Really didn't like her. However, I feel like the kind of contrast between a toxic romantic relationship and healthy friendship was really good. And it's quite unusual, I feel like, to have a relationship break down in a book. I feel like so often you start a book where it's just ended and you go on to a new relationship, but this one was just kind of focusing on this relationship breaking down. And there was a quote I wrote down, I can't remember it, if I can find out, put it on the screen or something, where it said something like, love is hard and it's not like the movies because a lot of the time breakups happen when you still love the person, but you know it's the best thing to do to break up with them. And I thought that was really sad, but also a very poignant kind of story quote, and I very much liked it. The next book I read was Dark by Angie Sage. This is book 6 in the Septimus Heap series, so obviously can't really tell you what it's about, but the series follows Septimus, who is the 7th son of a 7th son who is overly magical, and follows him on his adventures with his sister Jenna, his best friend Beetle, and his teenage dragon called Spitfire, and his teenage dragon called Spitfire. I'll be honest, I had a really crap day one day last week, a couple of weeks ago, and I just kept wanting to cry, and so I thought I'm going to pick this up. I was at work, the ebook was available, I thought I'm just going to pick this up because I need something that I'm familiar with. I need something that will make me happy, and whilst it did make me happy, or at least distracted me, it wasn't familiar to me, much to my surprise. I think I must have only read this once before, which is quite incredible because it is my favourite series, but I've never read the final book, so obviously I never felt the need to read this one. I found myself really shocked and really tense and really kind of rooting for the story to work out well because I didn't know how it was going to happen. Much to my surprise, I didn't really like Jenna and Septimus in this. I thought they were both a bit spoiled and a little bit bratty, which to be fair isn't their fault. They are only 14 in this, they are both teenagers and they're just really bad at communicating. It renewed my love for Beetle. I always loved Beetle, and in this he is like the superhero and I thought he was amazing. Something happened to him and I audibly gasped. I was not okay with that happening. He was okay. I was happy. I really liked all the different kind of groups of characters interacting. You get a lot of characters interacting that don't normally see each other, and I thought that was quite effective. And once again, we learn a lot more about the history of magic in this world. We tie up a lot of loose ends, but we also leave a couple of things open for the final one. I have a feeling I know where the final one is going to go now, but I still need to read it, so I don't know. And I don't want to like read the blurb and spoil it, even though it won't be spoiling, but you know what I mean. Very much excited to finally be able to get onto the final book now. The next book I read was The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I'm going to try and not talk too much about this because I am planning on reading it this month as well, and I'm planning on annotating it, basically because, and this is my main point in my review, Samantha Shannon writes books that grow on you with every read, that mean more each time you come back to them, and I very much felt it with this read. I had read it last year, felt impartial to it because I love Priory so much. I was expecting to absolutely adore the Bone season because everyone else did, but I just didn't love it, and I was really disappointed, but I did love it a lot more this time. I rated it 4 stars. So this book follows a girl called Paige Mahoney, who is a clairvoyant in a world where these government don't want clairvoyants to exist, and so they are kind of chased and ostracized, so they live in an underground kind of criminal world. But one day she accidentally kills a couple of people and ends up where she thinks is going to be prison, but is actually a secret city that should have been destroyed about 200 years ago. Like I said, she writes books that grow on you with each read, and there are so many hints of what's to come, or so many things that mean more if you know what's already come, you know what is coming. And one of those things is Paige's demisexuality. Again, ace character. I love Paige. This is one of the reasons why I really hoped I was going to like these books, because Paige is demi, and like that was the first time I'd ever encountered a character that was demi. And one of the things when I was reading it were there were a couple of hints towards that, and I want to know if they actually were hints or whether I was just making it up. But next time I read it, that's one of the things I'm going to be closely looking for. Also, the world building in this is amazing. Samantha Shannon creates such rich worlds, and especially in such a kind of claustrophobic setting, it's really generally only set in 1 or 2 places, and to make it so rich and the world so interesting is just so well done. And the characters too, very rich. They're so nuanced. No character is inherently good or bad. There is always kind of a disagreement over who is right and wrong, and I think that's really interesting. The next book I read was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is one of those few classics that I do want to read and obviously have since read. I really like Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, so I thought I'd like this, and I did. I rated it 3 stars. This is about a guy called Dorian Gray who has a portrait painted of him and makes a wish, or it's a magic portrait, I don't quite know how it works. And basically, if he does anything bad, it never reflects physically on him, the portrait changes to reflect him. And it's one of those concepts, one of those stories I know about, but have never like experienced, so a lot of things that happened in it surprised me. I found it a lot more readable than I was expecting to. I really like Oscar Wilde's writing, like I said, and so I found it quite easy to get through generally. There was one chapter in the middle which I was warned about, which just nothing happened and I was so bored. But other than that, it was good. None of the characters were particularly sympathetic, which was fine, and there was a sense of mystery that kind of kept me reading. And yeah, I very much enjoyed it. Would probably buy my own copy at some point, but I did borrow this one from the library. Speaking of classics that I do want to read, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is, again, one of those classics that I feel like I should read because it's so pivotal to the fiction genre, because it's like an important book written by a woman, like such a pivotal story. It's about a guy called Frankenstein who creates a monster, and the monster goes on some rampages, and it's all Frankenstein's fault, but he doesn't take the blame. Again, it's one of those stories that I have heard of. Obviously, everyone knows about Frankenstein's monster. He is your classic Halloween villain monster thing. But much to my surprise, it wasn't really horror. It was kind of more gothic, and the horror was not really the monster. I knew that the monster wasn't going to be green and have bolts coming out of his nose, throat, neck. But I was really surprised to find him quite so sympathetic. He's a vegetarian, and there's much more to him than I was expecting. I didn't expect so many horrible things to happen to him, but also nothing happened. It was very easy to read generally. Beyond kind of the first 30 pages, it was very easy to read, but yeah, just nothing happened. But yeah, I did enjoy it. It was good, and I'm glad I have now finally read this. Next, I read All the Bad Apples by Moira Fowley Doyle. This is an Irish YA contemporary about a girl who, on her 17th birthday, realizes she's cursed, and so bad things start happening to her, but also her sister has disappeared like 2 weeks after her birthday, and then she starts getting letters from her, and so she decides to start following them to try and find her. I really like the creepy kind of ghosty atmosphere in it. It kind of created monsters that shouldn't exist, but you weren't quite sure whether or not they were really there. And there was kind of a sense of mystery that kept me reading. I liked how all the characters interacted with each other, and I liked kind of the commentary both on witches and expectations and LGBT plus kind of feelings in the past, and also just being a woman in the past, like, but also not the distant past. Like, the women in this are kind of spoken about in the last 100 years or so, and their world is not good. Their world is not happy, and it's an interesting exploration on things like pregnancy and motherhood and just not being who people expect you to be, but not wanting to change. And I very much enjoyed it. I rated it 4 stars. The penultimate book I read in October is one I've been trying to read on and off since March, but it fit with the theme of Forgotten Women once again, so I thought I'm gonna finish it this month. And that is A History of the World with the Women Put Back In by Kirsten Looker and Ute Denshel. This is, as it says on the tin, A History of the World with the Women Put Back In. It literally covers from kind of, where does it start? It starts with the beginning, prehistory, Sumerians and Babylonians, and the Nile and the Indus Valley, the Shang and the Zhou, one god, and kind of goes on to now, the present, the Cold War, the World Wars and things. It finishes with people like Greta Thunberg, and kind of people that are still alive now. And yeah, it starts with these women who were apostles and who were historians when they weren't allowed to be. It's really, really interesting. It is very comprehensive, and I liked that it wasn't just a white history. I liked that it showed actually the world rather than just the world, i.e. a white kind of Christian world. But because it was so comprehensive, it was also really brief. It had lots of women, but sometimes they'd only get a line, which is a shame, but obviously not a fault of the authors. It's kind of a fault of the history, because a lot of the time they'd be like, here's a woman, we think she was around, but men have basically destroyed all evidence of her or records of her, or they've turned her into a man. Like, there was one woman who was like called Jonah or something, but they changed her name to Jonas, so people would think she was a man, even though Jonas wasn't a... maybe it wasn't Jonas. But anyway, like, they changed her name so she'd look like a man so we could accept it. And I think that's like a real shame, but I thought it was really interesting, and would definitely recommend kind of dipping in and out of it rather than reading it all in one go, because where I was reading it all at once, I did sometimes get a little bit bored, but not a fault of the book, just a fault of me. And the final book I read in October, I was so excited to read, and I've been excited to read it for ages, but then when I heard there was a pan-romantic asexual character in this, I thought I'm gonna have to pick it up this month, and that was Raybearer by Jordan Ifueko. I have the Fairy Loot edition, which is extra shiny and hardback, and it has pretty sprayed edges. It was so good. This follows a girl called Tarasai, who is born of this woman called the Lady, but never sees the Lady. But when she does, she's told she has to join the Prince's Council of 11 and then kill him. But she doesn't really want to do this because the council's prince was... what? Because the Prince's Council of 11 is all she's ever wanted is a family, and she obviously doesn't want to destroy that by killing him. I read the sample of this back in August and absolutely adored it. Expected I would rate it 5 stars, and I have actually rated it 4 stars, which is a little bit disappointed, but I'm not disappointed in the story. There is just one particular element I wish they could have done more with, but I will explore that. I thought it was a really interesting world. It's so rich. There is so many kind of elements of the story. It's obviously based in Africa, and so there are like lots of different kind of countries or elements of this bigger area. and there were so many kind of different cultures and religions and explorations, and such a complex and unique magic system and political system, and I thought they were really well explored, but also left enough to explore in the sequel. I think it's going to be a sequel. I don't think there are going to be sequels. Despite that, it was still really easy to read. I wanted to fly through it, but also wanted to take my time with it. I wanted to listen to the audiobook because the audiobook was really good, but also like I wanted to read it because I didn't want to miss anything, and so I kind of just dived in and out. I could never tell which way the story was going to go. It shocked me a few times. I really liked Tarasai's character. She was just so heartfelt and cute and happy, but like torn in different directions because she had so many conflicting kind of motivations. The thing I wish could have been done better, because it was the thing that I thought when I finished like reading the sample, I thought this is going to be amazing, this is going to be like unique, this is going to blow me away, was the kind of Council of 11. There are like 11 or 12 characters and we only get to see really like 4 of them, and I don't want to say it was disappointing because it wasn't. I still really like the characters we got. I just feel like it wasn't completely explored. I feel like having a pan-romantic character in YA fiction is so unusual, and I just wish, and also an asexual character, like we don't get to explore them enough, and I feel like they could have done. And I understand why they weren't together all the time, and I understand like not all of them could have had like fully formed characters, because 11 like unique characters isn't unusual, but it is hard, and I just wish we could have got a little bit more with them. But I did absolutely adore it, and yeah, rated it 4 stars, would definitely recommend. And so yeah, that's the end of my wrap up. I'm sorry if you've had to make it this far. I'm sorry I babbled quite so much, but I had a lot of books to talk about, and I really enjoyed a lot of them. There was only one I didn't like, which is pretty good for 17 books, so I'm quite pleased. If you enjoyed any of them yourself, let me know. Comment down below to let me know you're here. Like this video if you did, subscribe if you're not already, and I will promise to talk less in my next video. Bye!